Hello and welcome to my history podcast. Thank you so much for tuning in. I have always wanted to share my love and passion of history, especially in the form of a podcast. So I thought our first topic should be one of my favourite royal families of English history, and that is the Tudors. And what better place to start than with the first Tudor monarch, King Henry VII. King Henry VII, the first Tudor king, husband of Queen Elizabeth of York and father to two Queens of Europe and King Henry VIII. Henry VII became king on the 22nd of August 1485 when he defeated King Richard III at the Battle of Bosworth. Legend has it that they found the old king's crown in a bush and crowned Henry Tudor King of England on the battlefield. Although, I think it's just that. A legend. Despite the battle not taking place till the 22nd of August, King Henry VII dates the start of his reign as the 21st of August 1485. That's the day before. This is Henry's way of asserting his claim as the rightful king and not to be seen as a usurper, like his predecessor. But that makes me question, why did he feel the need to do so? Is it because Henry realised that his claim to the throne was not a strong one? Is it because he knew himself that he wasn't the rightful king? Well, today we are going to explore the founder of the Tudor dynasty, King Henry VII. Henry Tudor was born on the 28th of January 1457 to Lady Margaret Beaufort and Edmund Tudor at Pembroke Castle in Wales. Henry's birth, although a joyous occasion for Margaret, who would later devote her life to her son and him becoming king, was a difficult and traumatic experience. Margaret gave birth at the tender age of 13 and had been widowed just over 2 months earlier, as her husband Edmund Tudor died on the 3rd of November 1456. Henry's uncle Jasper and father Edmund were the younger half-brothers of King Henry VI. We can infer that the half-siblings got along, as both Jasper and Edmund were bestowed titles of the Earl of Pembroke and Richmond respectively, despite having no blood of English royalty. The three brothers shared the same mother, Dowager Queen Catherine of Valois, the youngest daughter of King Charles VI of France. Through her, they had a claim to the French throne, but not the English. So, where did Henry's claim come from? Henry Tudor's claim to the English throne comes from his mother, Lady Margaret Beaufort, who was the great-granddaughter of Catherine Swynford and John of Gaunt, the third son of King Edward III of England. However, Henry's claim is not as cut and dry as it seems. While John of Gaunt was married to his second wife, Constance of Castile, Catherine and John had several illegitimate children. John eventually married Catherine in 1396, and their children were legitimised. However, this came with a catch, that all of their descendants were barred from claiming the throne. As a descendant of John of Gaunt and Catherine Swynford, Henry Tudor has diluted royal blood, but he was technically barred from claiming the throne. Compared to many kings of English history, we actually know very little about Henry's childhood, as he was part of the minor gentry and was not a prince destined to be king. However, what we do know is that his father Edmund's death meant that Henry's uncle Jasper would become head of the family, who swiftly remarried his sister-in-law, Margaret Beaufort, to Sir Henry Stafford for her own safety and security. This was because by time Henry was born in 1457, the Wars of the Roses, also known as the Cousins' War, between the Yorks and the Lancastrians was in full swing, and Henry was a threat to the throne just by being a Lancastrian male. And as the years go by, Henry's place in the line of succession was continually creeped forward. 4 years later, in 1461, the Lancastrian army suffered a terrible defeat at the Battle of Mortimer's Cross. Edward, Earl of March, also the future King Edward IV, killed 3,000 Welshmen, and one of the victims was Henry's own grandfather, Owen Tudor, who was executed at the Market Cross in Hereford. Jasper fled and promised to avenge his father with the might of the Lord. Later that year, in March 1461, was the Battle of Taunton, also known as the Bloody Meadows, known as such because it has the highest death count in English history. The York army went for an all-out onslaught on the Lancastrians. 28,000 people were killed in one day. Just for a bit of comparison, 19,000 people died in the Battle of the Somme. Jasper was not present at the Battle of Taunton. However, the Lancastrian defeat meant it was dangerous for Jasper to remain in England and Wales. As a result, Uncle Jasper was forced to flee. Jasper was stripped of his title as the Earl of Pembroke, and the current King Henry VI, his wife Queen Margaret of Anjou, and their son Edward, Prince of Wales, fled to Scotland, and Edward, Earl of March, was crowned King Edward IV in the June. Okay, so with Jasper gone, what happened to young Henry Tudor? Well, Henry Tudor was placed in the charge of the new Earl of Pembroke, William Herbert, where he was brought up at Raglan Castle, under the care of Herbert's wife, Anne. It wasn't uncommon at the time for members of the nobility to have their children cared and educated away from the family home. Margaret Beaufort would pay occasional visits to her son, but they would not be reunited for another 9 years until 1470. In 1470, King Edward IV received a brutal blow after 9 years on the throne. The man that put him there, Warwick the Kingsmaker, switched allegiances from the House of York to the House of Lancaster and forced King Edward IV from the throne. Edward IV went into exile. His Queen Elizabeth Woodville and her children sought sanctuary at Westminster Abbey, and the Lancastrian King Henry VI returned to the throne. This provided Margaret Beaufort the opportunity to reunite with her son Henry Tudor, and as her family fortunes had changed, she was able to pay for a bow and a sheaf of arrows to give to her son for his amusement. And Jasper Tudor was able to return from exile and was restored to his earldom. This sense of normality for the Lancastrians did not last long, as King Edward IV returned from exile in Holland in March 1471. Within the space of a month, 2 critical battles had taken place: the Battle of Barnet on the 14th of April and the Battle of Tewkesbury on the 4th of May. King Edward IV had reclaimed the throne of England, and the battles resulted in the deaths of Warwick the Kingsmaker, Henry Tudor's stepfather, Henry Stafford, and Edward, Prince of Wales, the son of King Henry VI, who, by the way, King Henry VI suspiciously died in the Tower of London after that battle. The death of King Henry VI and the Prince of Wales meant that Henry Tudor had become the sole surviving Lancastrian heir. The other 2 Beaufort males had already died. After the defeat of the Lancastrian forces, Jasper Tudor was trapped within Pembroke Castle. The siege of the castle was broken by a man called David Thomas. This allowed Jasper and Henry Tudor to flee to the harbour, where they hid in a cellar that was owned by Thomas White. When night fell, they escaped through a tunnel, and the pair boarded a ship to France to seek refuge from King Louis XI of France and ask for his support. Or at least that was the plan, but the ship got blown off course and they landed in Brittany, which is a part of France today, but in 1471 was its own duchy. Duke Francis II of Brittany offered the Tudor travellers refuge, but he realised the value of the two and kept them under close supervision. He kept nephew and uncle separate, with Henry being sent to the isolated Tour de Elven, where he was imprisoned on the 6th floor of its keep. Henry Tudor would effectively spend the next 14 years of his life as Francis II's prisoner. During his exile, King Edward IV made several failed attempts to entice Francis to give him the Tudors, including offering his eldest daughter Elizabeth of York as bride to Henry. Although none of Edward's attempts worked, this may have sown the seed later in life for Henry to marry Elizabeth, as their match would be a strong one politically. On the 9th of April 1483, King Edward IV died, and is succeeded by his son, Edward, who becomes King Edward V. However, due to his age, he required a Lord Protector. So, King Edward IV's only surviving brother, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, becomes Lord Protector. Although, quite frankly, he doesn't exactly do a very good job, as both King Edward V and his little brother Richard mysteriously go missing in the Tower of London. I'm not too sure how you misplace human beings, so I'm very much sold on the theory that Richard, Duke of Gloucester, had the boys murdered so he could become king, as I believe that provides a pretty solid motive. But if you think differently to me, I'd be interested to know what you think. Do you believe in a different theory? Do you think Richard has become another figure done dirty by history? Let me know either way in the comments or on my social media. 26th of June, 1483, England had a new king. Shock! It's King Richard III, the former Duke of Gloucester. The usurpation of Richard III divided some of the Yorkists. There was even a tiny revolt in the October led by the Duke of Buckingham to dispose of Richard and replace him with Henry Tudor. But the revolt was defeated before Henry and his ships could land in England. With Buckingham's execution later that month, Henry and his ships turned tail back to Brittany. At this point in history, Henry is 13th in line to the throne. Well, if he's that far down the pecking order, why did so many people back him for the throne? Well, quite frankly, they didn't think that the other 12 could actually beat Richard in battle. That, and you've got to remember that Henry was the last Lancastrian heir, which meant that the other 12 were Yorkists. And if that's the case, they're probably quite happy where they are, or they didn't think that another usurpation was worth the risk. Christmas Day, 1483, in an attempt to rally support, Henry Tudor pledged an oath to marry Elizabeth of York should he become king. This pledge was more powerful than what it may seem. At this point in history, the country had been in a civil war for nearly 30 years, constantly changing kings, family allegiances, and the country was tired and bored. They were looking for stability. A Lancastrian king with a York heir as his wife? Now that would be ideal. Those who saw Richard as a usurper would rally round Elizabeth as the eldest surviving York heir, and the Lancastrians get their king. Any child produced from that union would be of both York and Lancaster, finally reuniting the two warring houses. By summer of 1485, Brittany was at war with France. King Richard III offered to provide a force of several thousand archers to aid Brittany in their conflict with France. But in return, the two Tudors, Henry and Jasper, were to be arrested and returned to England. Francis II agreed. Fortunately, Henry was tipped off about the plan with just hours to spare, and he managed to flee to the French court of King Charles VIII. The French agreed to equip Henry with money, ships, and mercenaries of the worst sort to launch an attack on Richard. And Henry and his army set sail from the mouth of the River Seine on the 1st of August 1485. Henry and his troops arrived at the coast of Pembrokeshire on the 7th of August 1485, and proceeded to march inland, amassing support as they travelled closer to London, eventually meeting Richard's army at the field of Bosworth. While Henry had been in exile, his mother, Margaret Beaufort, had remarried, this time to Thomas Stanley, a Yorkist landowner. However, Margaret had been begging Stanley to support her son's cause, and as a result, King Richard III had become very suspicious of Stanley's loyalty. As the battle drew nearer, more and more Yorkist landowners were defecting to Henry's side, and suspecting treachery from Henry's stepfather Thomas Stanley, Richard had imprisoned Stanley's son, George, Lord Strange, to ensure that Stanley was on his best behaviour. On the 22nd of August, 1485, the day of the Battle of Bosworth, Richard had awoken to find that his camp was unprepared to hear Mass or eat breakfast. Richard, who himself had slept badly, supposedly from a haunting nightmare, managed to get his army lined up for battle in the early hours of the 22nd of August. It was clear Richard's army was vastly superior with his countless multitude of men. Henry, on the other hand, bless him, only had 5,000 men at best, and he had to keep the French mercenaries away from the native soldiers in fear of them fighting each other. Not the best start to the battle of your life. Richard commenced his charge towards Henry's troops and noted that the men led by the Earl of Northumberland were standing still, and they were refusing to fight. Richard spotted Henry at the back of the battlefield, surrounded by a band of soldiers, and charged towards their ranks. Richard's men managed to kill Henry's standard-bearer, Sir William Brandon, while Richard's own standard-bearer, Sir Percival Thirlwall, had both of his legs hacked away beneath him. Nice. With Henry fearing imminent death, Sir William Stanley, Henry's step-uncle, charged with 3,000 men, which saw Richard being swept into a nearby marsh, where he was killed as the blows of the halberds rained down on him. Legend has it that it was these blows to the head that killed him, and that he was wearing his crown into battle, which undoubtedly would have made the blows 1,000 times worse. Richard, unsurprisingly, suffered massive trauma to the head, including one wound which cut clean through the skull and into his brain. The battle lasted less than 2 hours, and it was Henry's stepfather, Thomas Stanley, who found the old king's crown in the bushes and crowned Henry, King Henry VII of England, on the battlefield. I'm not entirely convinced that it played out exactly like this, but this is the story that the Tudors wanted us to remember. And as for the Tudors tweaking history, Henry VII recorded the start of his reign at Parliament as the 21st of August 1485, the day before the Battle of Bosworth. This was his way of claiming that he was already the rightful king before the battle and he wasn't a usurper, but he was rather a king that was just reclaiming a crown that was rightfully his. Henry VII was coronated on the 30th of October 1485 at Westminster Abbey. Henry had claimed the throne through conquest, and he therefore had himself coronated before his wedding, as a sign to his people that he was the rightful king in his own right, and not through his marriage, which arguably did strengthen his claim, but like a lot. During his coronation, the Archbishop of Canterbury declared Henry to be the rightful and undoubted inheritor by the laws of God and man to the English crown. Months later, on the 18th of January 1486, King Henry VII made good of his promise, and he married the eldest daughter of King Edward IV, Elizabeth of York. Although a political move, Henry presented his marriage as an act of reconciliation between the two houses, and it was the combination of the house's two roses that produced the infamous Tudor rose. The marriage was concocted between the bride and groom's mothers, Lady Margaret Beaufort and the Dowager Queen Elizabeth Woodville. It was Margaret who suggested Elizabeth as the suitable bride for her son to end the conflict. At the time of the wedding, Henry was 29 and Elizabeth was 19. Although very little is recorded of the actual ceremony, one court poet remarked, "Great gladness filled all the kingdom to see the warring houses united." Additionally, Henry had Elizabeth's illegitimacy reversed, an act that King Richard III, Elizabeth's uncle by the way, had done during his reign to secure his usurpation. This can also be interpreted as Henry believing that the two young princes, Elizabeth's brothers, were dead, as reversing her illegitimacy would also bring her brothers back into the line of succession had they been alive. 9 months later, in late September, the couple welcomed their first child, Arthur. Named after the fictional king, and the apparent ancestor of Henry VII? That's a discussion for another time. The new Prince of Wales was born in Winchester on either the late of the 19th or early hours of the 20th of September. Historians debate the actual day of birth as not enough evidence is provided to secure an exact date. And they all lived happily ever after. For 2 years. Between 1486 and 1503, King Henry VII and Queen Elizabeth had 7 children. However, 3 of those children, Elizabeth, Edmund and Catherine, all died in infancy. The other 4 children all made it to adulthood-ish. The next surviving child after Arthur was Margaret, the future Queen of Scotland and arguably the saviour of the Tudor dynasty. Margaret Tudor was born on the 28th of November 1489. Despite being shunned by her younger brother Henry, Margaret would arguably be the most important figure in history out of all of Henry and Elizabeth's children, as it would be Margaret and her descendants that shaped the English and British monarchy into what we know today. On the 24th of May, 1487, King Henry VII received his first major threat against the throne when Lambert Simnel was crowned King of England by his supporters in Dublin. But the two warring houses were reunited by Henry and Elizabeth's marriage. They have an heir that is both of York and Lancaster. So why would people want to revolt? Well, I'm glad you asked, you lovely listener. When Henry became king, many Yorkists had been disposed of at court. Understandably, Henry wanted people he could trust and reduce his ever-growing paranoia and anxiety. However, those Yorkists that had been disposed of at court saw a reverse in their finances, which, as a result, led to many plots to depose the new king. Plus, I'm sure the benefactor of Lambert Simnel had some personal motives too. Simnel was provided with a formidable military force that included 2,000 mercenaries, all of which was paid for by Margaret of Burgundy, the sister to George, Duke of Clarence, and Kings Edward IV and Richard III. Simnel was claiming that he was Edward, the Earl of Warwick, the nephew of Kings Edward IV and Richard III. The real Edward, Earl of Warwick, was the son of their brother George, Duke of Clarence, and to the unhappy Yorkists, the rightful heir to the throne. Henry and Simnel's forces met on the 16th of June. This was known as the Battle of Stoke. Simnel's forces were defeated at the Battle of Stoke, and this was the last major threat to Henry's throne. Because of this, some historians view the Battle of Stoke as the last remnants of the Cousins' War, also known as the Wars of the Roses. Henry realised Simnel was a fake and employed him in the royal kitchens. You might be thinking, "Oh, that's nice of him, give him a job, put him in the kitchens, makes a real change from chopping his head off. Well, you see, the thing is, growing up with relatively no money, compared to what he had as king anyway, meant that Henry was rather stingy when it came to spending money, and it was more expensive to send Simnel to jail than what it would be to pay him for honest work. Henry may have also genuinely felt sorry for a young man who was clearly trying to earn some money. Simnel was also better to Henry alive than what he was dead, as it isn't a great PR move to execute the man that some people believed was the rightful king, and if he was dead, Simnel would not be able to tell the people his real name and that it was all a scam. However, Simnel's actions did not come without repercussions. This uprising reminded King Henry of the powerful position that the real Edward, Earl of Warwick, and his sister Margaret Pole held in England, and the potential threat that they caused to him and his dynasty. Also, side note, because Simnel had been crowned King Edward VI, King Henry VII's future grandson, also known as King Edward VI, is technically either King Edward VII or King Edward VI II. Between 1488 and 1489, Henry focused on improving his position on the European power stage by arranging an alliance, or a wedding, between his son Arthur and Catherine of Aragon, the youngest daughter of King Ferdinand II and Queen Isabella I of Castile and Aragon. Ferdinand and Isabella represented everything that seemed desirable to King Henry VII. Having his son and heir marry an infanta of Spain was a massive power play and meant more to England than what it would to Spain. Ferdinand and Isabella were descendants of ancient monarchies. Their position was strong and their reputation was glorious. In March 1488, Ferdinand sent a representative to check the 19-month-old Arthur for deformities. Arthur was said to be dressed in gold. Ferdinand and Isabella were impressed by their reports of their future son-in-law. However, they were concerned about sending their daughter to a country whose king might be disposed of at any time. The events of Lambert Simnel the previous year was very fresh in their mind. Eventually, the union was agreed, Ferdinand agreeing to trade his daughter for English support in a war against France. In March 1489, they signed the Treaty of Medina del Campo. The treaty stated that the Infanta Catherine would bring 200,000 crowns as her dowry. That's roughly about 5 million today. And it confirmed the engagement between the English prince and the Infanta. Later that year, Henry would sign the Treaty of Redon, where he agreed to send 6,000 troops to Brittany to prevent neighbouring France from invading England, and his daughter Margaret was born in the November. 1491 saw the birth of King Henry VII's third surviving child, Henry, Duke of York, the future King Henry VIII. And also, on the 28th of June, golf was banned in Scotland. This was because King James saw it as a wasteful pastime. Nothing to do with Tudors, but I thought I would just add it in there. Jump ahead 5 years to 1496, and Henry and Elizabeth's last surviving child, Mary, future Queen of France, was born on the 18th of March. 1497 was a bit of a busy year for Henry VII. He sent his future daughter-in-law Catherine a blessed ring as a token of his fatherly affection. Cute. More likely to keep her father sweet for the dowry, as that was still about a decade away. And the couple were formally betrothed at the ancient palace of Woodstock in Oxfordshire during the August. But 1497 saw the return of Margaret of Burgundy. Clearly, this woman had a grudge against the Tudors. Whether she genuinely thought the pretenders were her family, as she had not lived in England for years, is unknown. But this time, she was back with Perkin Warbeck. Perkin Warbeck was claiming to be Prince Richard, Elizabeth of York's brother, and the prince who went missing in the Tower with Edward V. Warbeck had been throwing around his claim that he was Richard from about 1490, trying to gain support the same way that Lambert Simnel had back in 87. Warbeck at one point had the support of King Charles IX of France, King James IV of Scotland, Maximilian I of Austria, and Margaret of Burgundy, just to name a few. The support of these royals fluctuated throughout the years, But during that time, Margaret had coached Warwick on how to impersonate Richard. Warwick had tried and failed to invade England 3 times before being captured in 1497. Henry originally pardoned Warwick and fined the lords who supported him, actually making a £1,500 profit by overcharging. However, after several failed revolutions, Henry had Warwick beheaded along with the real Edward Earl of Warwick, son of George Duke of Clarence, on the 21st of November 1499 at Tower Hill. After this, Henry had multiple smaller attempts against him, like when his son died and when his wife died, as the family seemed vulnerable. But the challenge to Henry's reign continued throughout his life until he was succeeded by his son, King Henry VIII. The execution of Edward, Earl of Warwick, can seem unnecessary, as he was not linked to this uprising, nor did he really have any part in Simnel's. However, with every revolt by a pretender, Henry grew more and more concerned about the threat that George Duke of Clarence's children posed. Margaret Pole was likely spared due to being a woman, although that would not be enough to save her later in life, and Ferdinand was pushing pressure on Henry. Ferdinand was in no hurry to send his daughter to England. The recent appearance of Perkin Warbeck and the continued existence of Edward Earl of Warwick had made him cautious, and he was starting to look elsewhere for husbands for his daughter. This was likely the reason why Edward Earl of Warwick joined Warbeck. That, and he apparently plotted to escape the prison in the Tower of London with Perkin Warbeck. Oddly enough, Henry VII took a liking to Warbeck's wife, the Lady Catherine Gordon. His accounts show that he bought Catherine fancy clothes and expensive gifts, and she became a close companion even after Henry VII had her husband executed. Disaster struck at Christmas that year when a fire took place at Sheen Palace. The fire burned for 3 hours, nearly destroying the whole palace. Tapestries were turned to ash. The Tudor family barely made it out alive, but Henry had the palace rebuilt as the more familiar Richmond Palace. On the 19th of May 1499, a proxy wedding took place at Prince Arthur's manor house at Bewdley near Worcester. The wedding was officiated by Sir Richard Pole, and it was at this point that Ferdinand put the pressure on Henry to execute the Earl of Warwick. And when Henry, who was desperate to keep his Spanish friend, charged Edward with treason for conspiring with Warwick, the simple-minded fool pleaded guilty. Why would you plead guilty for something you didn't do? I will never know because I wasn't there. But I'm really struggling to understand why Edward Earl of Warwick actually pleaded guilty. Maybe he had more to do with it than what we know? A second proxy wedding took place again at Bewdley, exactly 2 years later to the day in 1501, and Henry and Arthur first met the Infanta Catherine on the 4th of November at the Bishop's Palace in Dogsmithfield. Henry rather embarrassed himself on this occasion. Catherine, who was exhausted from travelling, was sleeping. Henry was furious that he was not allowed to see the daughter-in-law that he had purchased for his son. Thinking that there was something wrong with her and that the Spanish were hiding something, Henry pretty much argued with them until they caved. They woke Catherine, and Henry was relieved that she was as pretty as described. Then they exchanged pleasantries through an interpreter, to which Arthur reportedly said to his parents, he had never felt so much joy in his life as when he beheld the sweet face of his bride. Now that's kind of super cute. Catherine and Arthur conversed together in Latin, and later that evening, Catherine entertained the king and her groom in her chamber with music and dancing. Henry and Arthur took their leave the next morning. On the 12th of November, Catherine made her state entry into London. The king, queen, and Prince Arthur watched the procession from the window of Master William Geoffrey in Cheapside. King Henry and Queen Elizabeth were noted to have worn crowns and velvet robes trimmed with ermine. 2 days later, Arthur and Catherine were wed at St. Paul's Cathedral. Life seemed to be good for King Henry VII. He had an heir and a spare. He had a loving wife. He was in negotiations with Scotland for sorting out the marriage for his eldest daughter, Margaret. Arthur was married to a powerful Spanish infanta who would hopefully provide Henry with grandchildren and future heirs to continue the Tudor line. Oh, how things can change. 5 months later, on the 2nd of April 1502, King Henry VII was asleep at Richmond Palace. His friar woke him, saying, "Your dearest son hath departed to God." Henry, who I could imagine was feeling a multitude of emotions all at once, cried. Elizabeth comforted her husband, reminding him that he has 3 other children and God is still where he was, and we are both young enough. It was then her turn. She too broke down, and Henry comforted her. Arthur Tudor, Prince of Wales, had died from the sweating sickness at his home in Ludlow Castle. He was 15. Catherine was now a widow, and no one really knew what to do with her. King Ferdinand wanted his daughter and her dowry to return to Spain, something that King Henry did not want. Ferdinand's threat was intended to scare Henry into agreeing a new marriage between Catherine and Henry, Duke of York, Arthur's younger brother. King Henry VII could see the advantages of this new union, but he had hopes that after 5 months of marriage, Catherine might be pregnant with Arthur's child. He asked her pretty bluntly if she was still a virgin, to which she said that she had only slept with Arthur for 6 nights and remained untouched. A marriage between the Duke of York and Catherine was desirable to both King Henry VII and the widowed Catherine. She was bored in mourning, and Henry could keep her dowry. This was because when a widow was mourning, they were not allowed to dance in public, they were not allowed to take part in court entertainment, and to Catherine, a second marriage was a way of escaping her mourning prison. Tragedy struck the Tudor family once again on the 11th of February 1503, as Queen Elizabeth of York dies in childbirth, trying to provide another male heir. Neither her or the baby girl, named Catherine, survived. News of the Queen's death was heavy and dolorous to the King, as ever was seen or heard of. The King departed to his chambers to pass his sorrows, and when he did re-emerge, the man that came out was altogether colder and more isolated, and one that began to treat his people with more harshness and severity than had been his custom. I think it's fair to say that the King never recovered from his wife's death. After Elizabeth's death, the question on everyone's lips was, who was the King going to remarry? It looked like at one point that King Henry was suggesting to marry the widowed Catherine to try and keep Catherine's dowry and the Spanish ties, but her parents were shocked and furious at the notion, so he quickly changed his mind and never did remarry. Instead, he proceeded with a treaty for his son, Henry, Duke of York, to marry Catherine 2 years later in 1505, when the Duke of York was 14. After Elizabeth's death, Henry VII became overly protective of Henry, Duke of York, and he was not allowed to leave his room except for exercise. The marriage treaty was signed on the 23rd of June 1503. 2 days later, the Duke of York and Catherine of Aragon were formally betrothed. The Tudor family was disrupted once again with Margaret Tudor, Henry's now eldest surviving child, leaving to go to Scotland. Margaret marries King James IV of Scotland at Holyrood Abbey on the 8th of August 1503, and later that year on Boxing Day, Henry and Catherine received their marriage dispensation from the Pope. On the 18th of February 1504, Henry, Duke of York, was formally created the Prince of Wales, but 8 months later, on the 26th of November 1504, Catherine of Aragon's mother, Queen Isabella of Castile, died. The news didn't reach England, though, till the December, and Catherine devalued overnight. You see, Isabella ruled Castile in her own right, and she did not put her husband as her heir. Instead, it went to her daughter Juana. Catherine was no longer the daughter of mighty Spain. She was now a daughter of the much smaller and less prestigious Aragon. Henry VII was now seriously considering the match for his son Henry, trying to get other alliances, and he stopped Catherine's allowances. The 28th of June 1505 was the 14th birthday of Henry, Prince of Wales, and he and Catherine were supposed to be wed soon. But King Henry VII, unbeknownst to Catherine, was trying to delay the wedding in hopes of a better match, but without losing her dowry. Catherine couldn't afford to pay her servants, and her gowns were getting shabby. Both Ferdinand and Henry refused to pay for her upkeep, as they saw it as the other's responsibility, although she was fed, so that's a plus point. King Henry VII was so desperate to get out of this wedding arrangement that the night before the Prince of Wales' birthday, he got his son in front of the Bishop of Winchester and made him revoke his betrothal to Catherine on the grounds that they were too young to have made an informed decision. This scandalous meeting was deliberately done in private, so Henry still had Catherine as an option, but if a better match presented itself, he could break the pre-contract without difficulty. It seems to me that somebody wants to have his cake and eat it. In the October, King Henry VII was in negotiations with Catherine's older sister, Juana, and her husband, Philip, in hopes of agreeing a marriage between the Prince of Wales and their 6-year-old daughter, Eleanor, who was a much greater prize than Catherine. What you've got to remember is that Catherine was devalued overnight by the death of her mother. Catherine was now only the daughter of Aragon, not the mighty Spain. Eleanor was the daughter of the Queen Regnant of Castile, Juana, who was Catherine's older sister, and through her mother, she was also the heir to Aragon, while her father, Philip, was the heir to all of the Habsburg territories. Juana's husband, Philip, also had a vendetta against his father-in-law, so this marriage would have been a great way of sticking it to Ferdinand. In the January of 1506, Philip and Juana made a surprise visit to England as they got shipwrecked off the English coast. King Henry welcomed them to Windsor Castle, and the two men seized the opportunity to continue discussing marriage arrangements between their children. Catherine, who had been shunned by the English royal family and still being kept as a pauper for someone of her status, was allowed to wear her nice dresses. Historians aren't too sure if her dresses were new or whether they were fixed, but in my personal opinion, considering how stingy Henry was, and knowing that he used to make Elizabeth of York get her dresses fixed so he didn't have to buy new ones, I'm going to say he had her dresses fixed. Henry only allowed Catherine 30 minutes with her sister. This was to try and prevent her from complaining to Juana about how she'd been treated. Henry was all about keeping up appearances, and she had hoped that Juana may be able to help her situation and potentially talk to their father. Juana, however, was too depressed and wrapped up in her own problems that Catherine never attempted to ask, and the sisters no longer had much in common. Okay, so what about the marriage? Did Philip and Henry come to an agreement? Well, no. Nothing got agreed, and that was the last we heard of it, so no. Philip and Juana left England in the April. In 1507, King Henry entered negotiations with Emperor Maximilian for a betrothal between his daughter, the Princess Mary, and Max's grandson, Charles of Castile, an alliance that would be highly advantageous for England and would also mean that Henry would no longer need Ferdinand or Catherine. In the autumn, Ferdinand had usurped his daughter Juana as the ruler of Castile, and Henry started to look upon Catherine in a more favourable light again. At the start of the year, Henry VII had hoped on marrying Juana himself, as Philip had died not long after returning from England the previous year. By marrying Juana, Henry would thereby rule Castile as well, as Juana's mental illness was starting to be evident. But to do so, he would need Ferdinand's permission. Don't forget, Juana and Catherine were sisters, and therefore they are both the daughter of Ferdinand. When Henry told Catherine of his plans to marry her sister, she supported the alliance between the two, as she thought that her own marriage to the Prince of Wales would get back on track. Catherine wrote to her father and did not expect him to want to keep Castile, but being the power-hungry monarch that he was, Ferdinand instructed Catherine to tell Henry that it was Not yet known whether Queen Juana will be inclined to marry again, although it was certain that if she did become so inclined, it shall be no other person than the King of England. But by the September, Henry had lost interest in Juana, as it became evident that Ferdinand was playing mind games and Juana was not going to remarry. By September 1508, King Henry VII had stopped Catherine's allowance once again, after years of back and forth between him and Ferdinand of who owes who money. Ferdinand threatened war if Henry went through with the negotiations between the Prince of Wales and Eleanor of Austria. At this point in time, King Henry VII realised that his health was failing him, and come January of 1509, it was strongly suggested by the king that his son should marry Catherine, out of fear of not having a succession. On his deathbed, King Henry admitted to his son that he was not happy over his poor treatment of the Princess Catherine and told his son to do the honourable thing. Although he revoked his vows in 1505, only the two Henrys and the Bishop of Winchester knew. The rest of the world thought they were still betrothed. And with that, King Henry VII, the first Tudor monarch, died at Richmond Palace on the 21st of April 1509. He was 52. He was ill for the last few years of his life, but there have been some discussion about whether he died from TB or an unknown illness. He was buried in the extravagant Lady Chapel he had built at Westminster Abbey and was laid to rest next to his beloved wife Elizabeth of York. Upon his father's death, Henry, Prince of Wales, became King Henry VIII, arguably one of the most infamous kings in English history. And although he was hesitant to marry Catherine, as she was his brother's widow, Ferdinand encouraged the union with the promise of the rest of her dowry and reassured the young king that they have been given dispensation from the Pope. King Henry VIII married Catherine of Aragon on the 11th of June 1509, and they had a joint coronation on the 23rd of June 1509 at Westminster Abbey. I hope you enjoyed this in-depth look at the reign of King Henry VII, the founding Tudor monarch. If you did, please consider supporting me in the best way you can, whether it's through subscribing or listening to another. In the next one, we will be visiting the early life and reign of King Henry VIII.